Rain hammered the restaurant windows like thousands of fists trying to break in. Grace Mitchell stood in the cramped kitchen of Giovanni's, her fingers wrinkled from soaking in dishwater for far too long, her back aching after 12 straight hours of carrying trays and scrubbing pots and pans. The stink of garlic and burnt tomato sauce clung to her uniform, a faded black polo shirt 2 sizes too big and a pair of pants frayed and torn since 3 years ago. Delivery. Tony's voice cut through the clatter of dishes. Table 7 called. Penthouse in Obsidian Tower. Big tip if you're fast. Grace wiped her hands on her apron, and her mind started doing what it always did, counting and calculating. Obsidian Tower was a 30-minute drive across Chicago. Gas money. Rent due in 3 days, and she was still short $250. The antibiotic prescription for Mia, her 3-year-old daughter with an ear infection, was still waiting at the pharmacy because she didn't have the money to pick it up. The pharmacist's sympathetic smile from that afternoon still burned in her memory. "I'll go," she rasped, her voice rough with exhaustion. Tony's eyebrows lifted. "It's almost midnight, Grace. That area. I need the money." She didn't wait for him to argue. She'd heard it all before. Single mom, dangerous city, 27-year-old woman with nobody to protect her. But danger was relative, wasn't it? Because when you'd already lost everything that mattered most, what was left to be afraid of? The warm, insulated bag pressed against her chest as Grace shoved open the back door into the alley. The rain soaked through her jacket instantly, cold streams running down the back of her neck. Her beat-up old Honda sat under a broken streetlight, rust steadily chewing through the doorframe. She'd bought it for $900 6 months ago, the most expensive thing she owned, except for her daughter's crib. The streets of Chicago glistened in wet black reflections, neon from massage parlors and pawn shops bleeding across the pavement. Grace drove with both hands clenched tight on the steering wheel, the wipers losing the fight against the downpour. Obsidian Tower rose ahead like a massive block of black stone, all glass and steel, utterly alien to her world of cracked floors and flickering fluorescent lights. The valet barely glanced at her, just flicked his hand and pointed her toward the entrance meant for service workers. Grace hugged the insulated bag and hurried to the elevator, her sneakers squeaking on the polished marble. Everything here shone. The walls, the floor, even the air seemed cleaner, carrying the faint trace of something expensive she couldn't name. The elevator climbed to the penthouse in silence. Grace's reflection in the mirrored wall looked small and swallowed up by her baggy clothes, dark circles under tired gray-blue eyes, brown hair slipping loose from her ponytail in wet strands that stuck to her skin. She turned her face away. The doors opened to a private foyer. Soft light. One single door at the end of a short corridor. No sound at all, except the whisper of ventilation and her own breathing. Grace knocked twice. Silence. She knocked harder. Delivery from Giovanni's. The door cracked open, and she found herself staring at a wall of muscle in an expensive black suit. The man's face looked carved from stone, his eyes cold and assessing. A scar ran from his temple down to his jaw. "Food's here." Grace lifted the bag, her voice trembling. Something was wrong. The air tasted metallic, sharp. The door opened wider. The man stepped aside. "Come in. I just need a signature. Come in." It wasn't a request. Her instinct screamed at her to run. But Grace thought about the pharmacy, about Mia's fever the night before, about the eviction notice tucked into her purse. She stepped over the threshold. The penthouse sprawled before her like something torn from a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed all of Chicago drowning in rain, lightning occasionally igniting the skyline in bright, violent flashes. Black leather sofa, abstract paintings on the wall, the scent of expensive cologne and cigar smoke. 4 men stood in the living room. They turned at the same time when she entered, and every cell in Grace's body recognized it. These were predators. They wore ordinary clothes, jeans and leather jackets, but they moved with a coordination so precise it made her skin crawl. One of them held a gun casually at his side. Grace's hands went numb, the food bag slipped, and she fumbled to catch it. "Who the hell is this?" one of them snarled, his accent thick. Eastern European, unmistakably Russian. "Just a delivery girl," the scar-faced man behind her said. "She just got here." They looked at one another. A silent exchange passed between them. Grace's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Tough luck, sweetheart," the man with the gun said. He was younger than the others, maybe 30, with eyes as icy as winter water. "Real tough luck. Grace backed toward the door, but the scar-faced man blocked her. Footsteps in the hallway made everyone freeze, confident, unhurried. The 4 men tensed, weapons appearing in their hands with practiced speed. The door opened. He walked in like he owned not only this penthouse, but the building, the city, the very air. Over 6'2", broad-shouldered in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Grace made in a year, black hair swept back from a face that looked sculpted from marble, all sharp edges and ruthless precision. A small scar on his chin only made him seem more dangerous. 2 bodyguards flanked him, suits just as expensive, eyes scanning the room without pause. But it was his eyes that trapped Grace. Deep black, nearly endless. They swept the room with a cold appraisal that stole her breath. This was a man who calculated outcomes, weighed human lives like coins, and spread fear without ever needing to raise his voice. His gaze found her, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Surprise, confusion, and then his attention shifted to the intruders, and his expression went empty as a locked vault. "Gentlemen," his voice was low and controlled, carrying a trace of Italian worn down by years in America. "I don't recall inviting you. Victor Petrov sends his regards," the gunman said, raising his weapon. "Your time's up, Luca Romano." The name hit Grace like a slap. Luca Romano, even she, a woman who avoided the news and lived inside her own small survival bubble, had heard the whispers. The Dark King of Chicago, the man who controlled everything from the shadows, an Italian mafia boss, a killer, untouchable, and she was standing in his penthouse while 4 men pointed guns at him. Luca's expression didn't change. "I see Victor still lacks imagination. He sends 4 men. His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. He either overestimates me or underestimates you. Either way, it's disappointing." "Enough talking," the gunman snapped. Everything happened at once. The 4 men moved together. Weapons up. Luca's bodyguards reacted, hands reaching for their guns. Time slowed, every detail crystallizing with horrifying clarity, and Grace moved. She didn't think. Thinking was for people with choices, with safety nets, with futures. She was a woman who had survived an abusive relationship, who had fled with empty hands and a child and a desperate scrap of hope. She had learned that sometimes you fought, not because you were brave, but because you had no other choice. Her hand found the delivery bag, the metal containers inside heavy, hot, solid. Grace swung. The bag slammed into the nearest assassin's wrist with a crack that echoed through the penthouse. His gun flew from his hand, spinning across the marble. Scalding marinara splashed from a broken container and hit him in the face. He screamed, clawing at his eyes. Grace dropped down. Her knees hit the floor with a burst of pain, but her fingers closed around cold metal. She grabbed the gun just as a rough hand seized her shoulder and yanked her backward. She twisted, drove her elbow into soft belly. A move from the 3 months of self-defense classes she'd taken after escaping Tyler. The man grunted, his grip loosening. A shot exploded. The sound was deafening, nothing like the movies. Glass shattered. Someone screamed in Italian. Grace flattened herself to the floor, the gun hugged tight to her chest, her ears ringing. A body fell beside her. One of the assassins, blood spreading across his shoulder. His eyes met hers, wide with shock and pain. And then a powerful hand grabbed Grace's arm and dragged her behind the black leather sofa. She found herself pressed into a wall of muscle, the scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder filling her nose. Luca Romano held her in his arms, one hand locked around her waist, the other holding a gun with cold precision. "Stay down," he said at her ear, his voice deep and commanding, and she shivered even in the chaos. Grace couldn't move even if she wanted to. His body was heat and controlled violence. His heartbeat was steady beneath her cheek, while her own felt like it was trying to tear free. Through the gap under the sofa, she saw polished shoes moving, heard fists striking flesh, heard muffled groans. In less than 2 minutes, it was over. When Luca finally released her and rose in one smooth motion, Grace was still on the floor, shaking. She looked up and saw all 4 assassins had been taken down, 2 unconscious, one groaning and clutching a bloody shoulder, one restrained by Luca's bodyguard. Luca adjusted the lapel of his suit as if nothing had happened. His dark eyes found her, then dropped to the gun still clenched in her pale hand. "Interesting delivery, girl," he said, his tone dangerously light. He extended his hand. "Who taught you to move like that?" Grace stared at his hand, the neatly trimmed nails, the platinum watch gleaming, the scarred knuckles that spoke of countless fights. This was the hand of a killer, a man who controlled a city from the shadows. But she took it. What choice did she have? Luca pulled her up as easily as if she weighed nothing. He didn't let go right away. Instead, his thumb brushed over the back of her hand, a gentleness so unbelievable from a man who had just overseen a slaughter. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace," she whispered. "Grace Mitchell. Grace." he repeated, as if tasting each syllable, memorizing it. Then he smiled, and that smile turned his cold face into something both seductive and deadly. "You just saved my life, Grace Mitchell." She shook her head. "Your men would have." "Half a second." He cut her off, his black eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. "In my world, half a second is everything." One of the bodyguards cleared his throat. "Boss, we need to clean up." And her. Luca didn't take his eyes off Grace. "She stays." His voice was like an iron chain closing around her throat. "We've got a lot to discuss, Grace Mitchell." And when the most dangerous man in Chicago said her name for the third time, Grace knew her life had changed forever, all because of a bag of pasta and an impulsive decision by a delivery girl who had nothing left to lose. What would happen next to Grace? Would she escape the Mafia world? Or would she be pulled deeper into Luca Romano's arms? If you want to know the answer, please like to support the channel, share with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Everything unfolded with a speed and precision that left Grace breathless. In less than 30 seconds after Luca gave the order, the penthouse doors opened and a stream of men poured in. They wore identical black suits, their faces cold as stone, moving with such perfect coordination that Grace felt like she was watching a carefully choreographed ballet, a ballet of crime. Luca stood in the center of the living room with a phone to his ear, his voice low and razor-sharp as he issued orders in Italian. Grace didn't understand a word, but she didn't need to. The way the men obeyed instantly, the way they lowered their heads as they passed him, told her everything. This was Luca Romano's kingdom, and in this kingdom, his word was law. 2 men grabbed the nearest unconscious assassin and dragged him toward the service elevator, as if he were nothing more than a bag of trash. Another appeared with a bucket and rags, knelt in the spreading pool of blood on the marble, and began scrubbing. No one spoke. No one looked disgusted or afraid. This clearly wasn't their first time. Grace stood pressed against the wall, her legs shaking so badly she was afraid she'd fall. The gun was still in her hand, and she didn't know what to do with it. She looked down at her own fingers, white-knuckled around the cold metal, and wondered if this was really her life. 20 minutes ago she'd been washing dishes in a kitchen that reeked of burnt garlic. Now she stood in a mafia boss's penthouse, watching bodies being hauled away like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. A man went to the shattered window and quickly covered it with a thick plastic sheet that seemed to appear from nowhere. Another gathered the glass scattered across the floor. In less than 10 minutes, the penthouse was almost restored, as if the gunfight had never happened, as if 4 men had never tried to kill the owner, as if Grace had never thrown a bag of pasta into an assassin's face. She laughed, a choked sound, almost hysterical. Every gaze in the room turned toward her, but she couldn't stop. This was madness. All of it was madness. A warm hand touched her arm, and the laughter died in her throat. Grace looked up to find Luca standing in front of her, his dark eyes holding something she couldn't read. He gently removed the gun from her hand, passed it to one of his bodyguards without looking, then turned back. "Take her to wash up," he said to someone behind her. "Then bring her to the smaller sitting room. I'll be there shortly. I need to go home," Grace heard herself say, weak and strange. "My daughter." Luca tilted his head, and for a heartbeat she saw something soft pass through those cold eyes. "We'll talk about your daughter," he said, his voice dropping lower. "About everything. But first, you need to calm down." Then he turned away and walked toward the men waiting for orders, leaving Grace standing there with her heart battering her ribs and one question echoing through her mind. What kind of world had she just stepped into? The smaller sitting room was far less grand than the main room where the gunfight had just happened, but it still radiated a kind of luxury Grace had never touched in her life. Cognac-colored leather chairs, a polished oak coffee table, and an abstract painting on the wall that probably cost more than the apartment she rented. She perched on the edge of a chair, her back rigid, her hands on her thighs like a child called into the principal's office. Luca walked in a few minutes later, his charcoal suit jacket gone, the sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled to his elbows. Without the jacket, he looked a little less terrifying, but only a little. The hard muscle under the thin fabric, and the scar along his forearm reminded Grace exactly how dangerous he was. He sat in the chair across from her, set 2 glasses of water on the table, and stared at her without blinking. "Drink," he said. Not quite a command, but not an offer either. "You're in shock." Grace picked up the glass and took a small sip. The cold water slid down her dry throat, and she realized how thirsty she was. Now, Luca leaned back, one arm resting easily on the chair. "You're going to explain how a delivery girl knows how to disarm a trained assassin." Grace set the glass down, her hands still trembling. I told you. A self-defense class. A self-defense class, Luca echoed, one eyebrow lifting. What kind of class teaches reflexes like that? Free. At a community center. Grace looked down at her hands. 3 months, twice a week. They taught the basics. How to break free when someone grabs you. How to use your elbow. How to turn anything into a weapon. And you remembered all of that in a situation like tonight. Luca's voice stayed calm, but something sharper lived in his eyes. Most people freeze. Or run. You threw food in an assassin's face. Grace didn't answer right away. She thought about that night 2 years ago, lying on the kitchen floor with 3 broken ribs and a wrist twisted backward. She thought about Tyler standing over her, his face red with alcohol and rage, snarling that she was useless, that nobody would ever want her, that she should be grateful he still bothered to keep her around. I have a good memory, she said at last, her voice lower, for things that keep me alive. Silence. Grace looked up and saw an expression on Luca's face she'd never expected. Not pity, not curiosity. Something closer to understanding. Who? He asked, only one word. She knew what he meant, and she didn't know why she answered. Why she told a Mafia boss about the deepest pain she carried. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe after everything that had just happened, hiding felt pointless. My ex-boyfriend, she said flatly. Tyler Reed. We were together 2 years. At first he was perfect. Then he started drinking. Then he started hitting me. She paused, drew a breath. The last time, he broke 3 ribs in my wrist, told the doctor I fell down the stairs. And you let him do that? The question stabbed into Grace like a blade. She lifted her head, anger flashing in her eyes. I didn't let him do anything. Her voice turned cold. I waited until the bones healed. I waited until he went to work. Then I put my daughter in the car and I drove. I didn't stop until I reached a city he didn't know by name. I changed my number, changed my address, and signed up for a self-defense class the first week. She stared straight into Luca's eyes. I didn't let him do anything to me. It just took time to find a way out. The silence stretched. Then Luca did something that caught Grace completely off guard. He smiled, not the cold, calculating curve she'd seen earlier, but a real smile, softening the sharp lines of his face and lighting his dark eyes. For a moment, he didn't look like a Mafia boss at all. He looked like an ordinary man who had just heard something that genuinely impressed him. I believe you did, he said, his voice lower and warmer. I absolutely believe you. Grace didn't know how to respond. She'd told this story to a few people, and the reactions were usually pity, or disgust, or useless advice about what she should have done differently. No one had ever looked at her the way Luca looked now, like she was something worth admiring instead of something to feel sorry for. Now, Luca stood, the smile fading as his face returned to seriousness. We need to talk about the real problem. About why you can't go home tonight. Grace's chest tightened. Her daughter, Mia. Luca walked to the window and looked out at Chicago, drowning in rain. The city lights reflected across his face in shifting patches of shadow and glow. When he turned back, the seriousness in his dark eyes made cold run down Grace's spine. Viktor Petrov, Luca began, his voice slow and steady as if explaining a simple equation to a child. Is the man who sent those 4 to kill me tonight. He's a Russian boss, and he's not the kind of man who accepts failure. Grace swallowed. What does that have to do with me? Everything, Luca said. Those 4 should have reported back to him 20 minutes ago. They didn't. Right now, Viktor is wondering what happened, and he'll investigate. He stepped closer, stopping right in front of Grace, close enough that she could feel heat coming off his body. He'll check the building's security cameras. He'll see a delivery car arriving at the right time. He'll trace it back to Giovanni's, and then he'll trace the delivery person. Luca paused, his gaze locking onto hers. He'll trace you, Grace. Grace's blood seemed to turn to ice. But I didn't do anything. I'm just the delivery girl. You disarmed one of his assassins, Luca reminded her, one corner of his mouth lifting. Do you think Viktor will believe it was coincidence? That a delivery girl just happened to have fighting skills and just happened to decide to help me? Grace opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because she understood exactly what he meant. He'll think you work for me, Luca continued, his voice losing its sarcasm. He'll think you're part of my plan, and he'll want to eliminate you, or worse, take you for questioning. No, Grace sprang to her feet, the chair scraping back with a harsh sound. No, no, no. I have a daughter. She's only 3. She's at home with my neighbor. I need to go home. She turned to bolt for the door, but Luca was faster. His hand closed around her arm. Not painful, but unbreakable as steel. Grace, his voice dropped, carrying something almost gentle. Listen to me. If you go home now, you'll lead them straight to your daughter." The words hit Grace like a bucket of ice water. She froze, rooted to the floor. "I can protect you," Luca said, releasing her arm but not stepping back. "I have a safe place outside the city. High walls, electronic gates, guards on patrol 24 hours a day. You and your daughter will stay there until I settle things with Victor." Grace shook her head, feeling like she was drowning. "I can't. I have a job. I have rent due. I can't just disappear." "You have a job," Luca corrected, his voice harder now. "The moment you walked through my penthouse door, your old life ended. You can accept that and let me protect you, or you can go home and wait for Victor's men to find you." He tilted his head, his eyes cutting straight through her. "They won't be merciful like me, Grace, and they won't care that your daughter is 3. Grace's knees threatened to buckle. 2 years. 2 years running from Tyler, rebuilding her life from nothing, working 12 hours a day to feed her child. And now, because of one impulsive choice, everything was collapsing. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you want to help me?" Luca was silent for a long moment. Then he lifted his hand, his fingers touching her jaw lightly, tipping her face up so she had to meet his eyes. "Because you saved my life," he said in a low voice. "And in my world, that's a debt I have to pay." He lowered his hand, walked to the table, and picked up his phone. "Now give me your home address. I'll send someone to get your daughter immediately." Grace spoke her apartment address in a trembling voice, each number and street name leaving her mouth as if she were betraying herself. Luca listened, then spoke a few quick lines in Italian into the phone before ending the call. Less than 5 minutes later, one of his bodyguards appeared at the door and nodded to signal that everything was ready. They took the elevator down to the basement, where a sleek black SUV waited. Grace recognized right away that it wasn't an ordinary vehicle. The doors were thicker, the windows dark, and when she climbed inside, she felt the weight of it, armored. Luca Romano didn't go anywhere without protection. He sat beside her in the back seat, silent, staring out the window, while the SUV glided over Chicago's rain-slick streets. Grace didn't speak either. She was too exhausted, too frightened, and too worried about Mia to find a single thing worth saying. 30 minutes later, the vehicle stopped in front of her apartment building. Through the dark, tinted glass, Grace saw the place she'd lived for 2 years through an outsider's eyes for the first time. Walls stained with mildew, a rusted fire escape, a shattered first-floor window patched with black tape. Compared to the lavish penthouse she'd just left behind, this looked like it belonged to a different universe. But it was her home, the place where she'd rebuilt her life out of ashes. "Which floor?" Luca asked. "3rd, apartment 3C, but my daughter's in 3B, Mrs. Park's place." They climbed the stairs in silence, 2 bodyguards ahead, Luca and Grace behind. Each step echoed through the empty hallway, and Grace prayed no one would see them. She didn't know how she'd explain it if a neighbor asked why she was walking with 3 men in suits at 2 in the morning. She knocked on the door of apartment 3B, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. The door opened, and Mrs. Park's wrinkled face appeared in the gap, her eyes widening with fear when she saw the strange men standing behind Grace. "Grace? What happened? Who are these men?" "It's okay, Mrs. Park," Grace said quickly, forcing her voice to stay steady. "They're friends of mine. I need to take Mia right now." Mrs. Park looked from Grace to Luca, then to the 2 bodyguards standing behind them like statues. She clearly didn't believe a single word Grace had said, but she still opened the door wider and let them in. Mrs. Park's apartment was tiny and cluttered, but it was warm, and it smelled of familiar kimchi, and on the worn old sofa in the corner, Mia was asleep, her little body curled tight, her arms wrapped around the faded stuffed rabbit Grace had bought at a thrift store. Grace's chest tightened. She went to the sofa, knelt down, and gently brushed the brown curls back from her daughter's forehead. Mia looked so small, so fragile, completely unaware of the storm closing in on their lives. "Mama." Mia opened her eyes, sleepy brown gaze finding Grace. "Shh, sweetheart," Grace whispered, bending to kiss her forehead. "We're going on an adventure. Go back to sleep, okay?" Mia yawned, then looped her tiny arms around Grace's neck as Grace lifted her. The warm weight of her child against her chest made tears rise fast. Grace would do anything to protect this little girl. Anything. "I need to take Mrs. Park too." Grace turned to Luca, her voice firmer than she expected. "She knows where I am. If they come looking for me, they'll ask her." Luca looked at Mrs. Park for a moment, then nodded. "Fine. She comes with us." Mrs. Park opened her mouth to protest, but Luca's gaze stopped her cold. She looked at Grace, fear plain on her aged face. "Grace, what have you gotten yourself into?" Grace held Mia tighter, eyes heavy with exhaustion. I don't know, Mrs. Park. I really don't know. The SUV moved through the night, leaving Chicago's lights behind and driving into the blackness of the suburbs. Mia slept soundly in Grace's arms, her breathing soft and even, oblivious to everything happening around her. Mrs. Park sat beside them, hands clasped tightly, her elderly eyes flicking again and again toward Luca in the front seat. Grace understood her fear. She was afraid too. 40 minutes later, the SUV turned onto a private road lit by dim lamps along both sides. Then the estate appeared before Grace like a dream, or rather, like a fortress out of a fairy tale. Walls at least 10 feet high surrounded the entire property. A massive electronic gate slid open automatically as the SUV approached. Grace saw shadows moving in the dark, guards patrolling with weapons that glinted under the moonlight. The main house sat near Lake Michigan, warm light spilling from wide windows. Modern architecture blended with classic elegance, every line and surface radiating a wealth Grace had never witnessed in her life. This was Luca Romano's world, a world of power and money, a world utterly foreign to her moldy apartment and instant noodle dinners. The front door opened before they even reached the steps. A woman around 55 appeared, silver hair swept into a neat bun, an inviting face softened by a welcoming smile. I'm Sophia, she said, her voice carrying a faint Italian lilt. I manage this house. Please come in. You must be exhausted. Grace stepped inside, eyes widening at what she saw. Polished oak floors. A crystal chandelier. Paintings she suspected were originals. Everything was beautiful enough to hurt to look at, expensive enough that she was afraid to touch a single thing. The little one's room has been prepared, Sophia said as she guided them upstairs. Mr. Romano called ahead. He asked us to provide the very best. The door opened, and Grace couldn't stop the sharp breath that escaped her. The room looked like it had been lifted straight out of a children's design magazine. Soft, pale pink walls, a beautiful white crib with delicate carved details, shelves filled with stuffed animals, dolls, and toys Grace had never been able to afford. All of this, she whispered. Mr. Romano is very thoughtful. Sophia smiled. He wanted to make sure she had everything she needs. Grace laid Mia gently in the new crib, then carefully pulled Mia's old worn blanket over her, the one Grace had bought at a thrift store for $5, faded and frayed at the corners, looking completely out of place in this luxurious room. But it was the blanket Mia loved, the only one that truly helped her sleep. And in that moment, Grace understood that no matter where they were, no matter how life changed, some things had to stay the same. Sophia took Mrs. Park to the room next door, leaving Grace alone with her daughter. Grace stood beside the crib, watching Mia sleep, her fingers softly brushing her child's cheek. Footsteps behind her made her turn. Mrs. Park stood in the doorway, her old face drawn tight with worry. Grace, she whispered, can you tell me now what you've gotten yourself into? Grace looked at her, then looked back at her daughter sleeping in an expensive crib, in the room of a Mafia boss. I really don't know, Mrs. Park, she said, her voice exhausted to the bone. I truly don't know. Grace couldn't sleep. She tried, lying on the softest bed she had ever touched, wrapped in sheets so smooth they probably cost more than a month of her wages. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the 4 assassins turning to look at her, heard the deafening gunshots, felt the icy weight of the gun in her hand. So she gave up and sat by the window, staring out into the dark garden beyond. Moonlight laid a silver sheen across Lake Michigan in the distance, and now and then Grace saw the silhouettes of guards moving through the grounds, guns glinting at their sides. They patrolled without rest, like wolves guarding their territory. And somehow, she had become part of that territory. She thought about Mia sleeping in the room beside hers, about Mrs. Park likely lying awake too, about the empty apartment in Chicago she might never return to. She thought about her job at Giovanni's, about Tony probably wondering why she hadn't come back after the delivery, about Mia's prescription still waiting at the pharmacy. Her life, the life she'd fought to build for 2 years, had shattered into pieces because of one impulsive decision on a rainy night. The sound of an engine broke the silence. Grace looked out and saw headlights sweep across the driveway. A black SUV, like the one that brought her here, stopped at the front door. The car door opened, and even in the darkness she recognized the tall figure stepping out. Luca Romano was back. She didn't know where he'd gone for the past several hours, but the way he moved, heavier and slower than he had at the penthouse, told her it hadn't been anything good. A few minutes later, a soft knock came at her door. Grace stood, pulled the thin cardigan Sophia had placed in the wardrobe around her shoulders. and opened it. Luca stood there, still in his white shirt but without the suit jacket and tie, sleeves rolled to his elbows to reveal strong forearms marked with scars. His black hair was no longer slicked neatly back, but messy, as if he'd run his hand through it too many times. And on that handsome face, Grace saw a fatigue he didn't bother to hide. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Not a question." "Neither are you," she replied. One corner of Luca's mouth lifted. "I've got a reason." "I do too." Grace stepped aside. A silent invitation. He entered, and she closed the door behind him. They stood in a room dimly lit by moonlight spilling through the window. Grace realized it was the first time they were truly alone. No bodyguards, no Mrs. Park, no one else. The air thickened. "Victor's people have been handled," Luca said, breaking the silence. "The 4 at the penthouse, and a few others. I sent Victor a message. He'll understand that touching me was a mistake." Grace didn't ask what handled meant. She didn't want to know. "What about me?" she asked instead. "Am I safe?" Luca stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his heat, close enough to catch the lingering scent of smoke and gunpowder in his clothes. "You're too memorable to stay hidden, Grace Mitchell," he said quietly, his black eyes holding hers without blinking. "Victor will find you, that's certain. But when he does, he'll see you protected, and he'll have to think carefully before he acts." "Why are you doing all this for me?" Grace asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just a delivery girl." Luca lifted his hand, fingertips brushing her cheek. The gentleness of it stole Grace's breath. "You're not just a delivery girl," he said, his voice dropping. "You're the woman who threw pasta in an assassin's face to save a stranger. You're the woman who ran from an abuser with nothing but empty hands and a newborn baby. You're a survivor. Grace, a survivor." His finger traced lightly along her jaw, then paused at her chin. "And in my world, people like you are rare." Grace didn't know what to say. She stood there, heart racing, staring into the eyes of the most dangerous man she'd ever met, and wondering why she wasn't afraid. Why, instead of fear, she felt safe. Luca lowered his hand, stepped back. "Sleep," he said, his voice returning to calm. "Tomorrow we've got a lot to discuss." Then he turned and left the room, leaving Grace alone with her heart still pounding and her skin still warm where he'd touched her. Morning sunlight poured through the window when Grace woke, and it took her a few seconds to remember where she was. Not her damp apartment in Chicago, not the old bed with springs that jabbed into her back, but the mansion of a Mafia boss, with silk sheets and expensive furniture. She hurried into the next room and let out a shaky breath of relief when she saw Mia still sleeping peacefully in the new crib, the stuffed rabbit held tight in her arms. Sophia had brought breakfast up for Mrs. Park, and the elderly Korean woman looked at Grace with worried eyes but said nothing. Grace knew she was waiting for an explanation, but Grace had nothing to give. She was just as lost. Near noon, one of the bodyguards appeared at the door and told her, "Mr. Romano wanted to see her in his office." Grace followed him through long corridors, down the stairs, to a room with a heavy oak door. The guard knocked twice, opened it, and stepped aside. Luca's office was all dark tones, walnut and leather, bookshelves reaching the ceiling, a massive desk placed in front of a window overlooking the lake. Luca sat behind it, still in a black suit, as if he'd never slept, his dark eyes watching her walk in. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Grace sat, spine straight, hands on her thighs. She felt like she was being interrogated. "I had someone look into you," Luca said, blunt and without preamble. Heat rose in Grace's blood. "What did you do?" "Investigate," he repeated, calm as if he were talking about the weather. "I needed to know who I'm protecting. And I found some interesting things." "You had no right." Grace shot to her feet, the chair scraping back. "That's my private life. You're living in my house, protected by my men, eating my food." Luca leaned back, eyes never leaving her. "I've got every right." Grace wanted to scream, to smash something, to walk out and never come back. But she knew she couldn't. Not while Mia slept upstairs. Not while Victor Petrov was still hunting her. "So what did you find?" she asked through clenched teeth. Luca slid a file across the desk. "Tyler Reed, your ex-boyfriend, the one who broke 3 ribs in your wrist." Grace stared at the file like it was a snake. "He filed for custody 6 months ago," Luca continued, voice steady. "Claimed you kidnapped his daughter. Claimed you're mentally unstable and unfit to raise a child." "That's a lie," Grace whispered, like someone had punched her in the stomach. "Mia is my child. He has no right. His name is on the birth certificate because you were still with him when Mia was born, and he believes he is the father," Luca said. "Legally, He has the power to take her. Grace shook her head, knees weakening. She'd thought she was safe. Thought Tyler would never find her. Thought she could start over. There's more, Luca said, his voice lowering. This morning, Tyler Reed reported you missing. He claims you may be in danger, and he requested an emergency order to take Mia into temporary custody. The office seemed to tilt. Grace gripped the back of the chair to keep from falling. If the police find you, Luca said slowly, they'll take Mia, and they'll hand her to Tyler. No, Grace's voice was a hiss. No, I won't let that happen. I'd rather die. Luca studied her for a long moment, unreadable. You don't have to die, he said at last. You just have to let me help. Grace was still trying to process Tyler when Luca turned to the next page of the file. She saw a photograph, and her blood turned to ice. The face in the photo wasn't Tyler. It was another man. A man she'd tried to forget for almost 4 years. A man she'd never told anyone about. Kevin Park. Luca read, voice even. 28 years old. Serving a 4-year sentence for armed robbery. And according to a private DNA comparison my team conducted using records from the clinic where Mia was treated, he's your daughter's biological father. The room spun. Grace clung to the chair, feeling the ground give way beneath her. He's Mrs. Park's nephew, Luca continued, unaware of how she was breaking apart. And according to the letters she sent to the prison over the past 6 months, she told Kevin about Mia's existence. No, Grace whispered. She promised me. She promised she wouldn't tell anyone. It seems she changed her mind, Luca said without emotion. Kevin Park will be released early for good behavior, 2 weeks from now. And he's hired a lawyer and filed for custody. Grace squeezed her eyes shut, and memory surged like floodwater. She met Kevin during those few weeks she briefly escaped Tyler's reach, 4 years ago. It was a short, beautiful dream before the nightmare of Tyler dragged her back. She had no choice but to let Tyler believe the child was his just to survive his rage, which is why his name ended up on the birth certificate. He was handsome, gentle, with a smile that made her forget the pain still burning in her ribs. They dated for 3 months, 3 short months when she believed she'd found happiness. Then she discovered she was pregnant, and at the same time, she discovered Kevin wasn't who he claimed. He wasn't an office worker. He was a criminal, robbing banks, convenience stores, anything with cash. She learned that when she saw his face on the evening news, wanted by the police. She ran that night, before he could come back. She ran to a new city with a growing belly and a shattered heart. She gave birth to Mia alone, raised her alone, and swore no one would ever know who her child's father was. But Mrs. Park knew. She recognized it the first time she saw Mia, because the little girl had the same brown eyes as her nephew. Grace begged her to keep it secret, and Mrs. Park agreed. Until now, Tyler doesn't know Mia isn't his, Grace said, her voice shaking. He thinks she's his daughter. That doesn't matter, Luca replied. What matters is you now have 2 men trying to take Mia. Tyler Reed, the abuser who believes she's his, and Kevin Park, the biological father getting out of prison. Grace's knees buckled. She didn't sit back in the chair. She collapsed onto the floor, both hands clamped over her head. 2 years. 2 years running. 2 years rebuilding. 2 years working herself to exhaustion to raise her child. And now everything was falling apart. Viktor Petrov wanted her dead. Tyler wanted her child. Kevin wanted her child. She was surrounded, with nowhere to go. Footsteps approached, and Luca knelt in front of her. His hand lifted her chin, forcing her to look into his eyes. Grace. His voice was low and unyielding. Look at me. She did, tears blurring her vision. I told you, he said. You don't have to die. You just have to let me help. His black eyes held hers without blinking. Tyler Reed is a problem I can solve in a few hours. Kevin Park is more complicated, but it's not impossible. Why? Grace asked, her voice shattered. Why are you doing all this for me? Luca didn't answer right away. His thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear as it fell. Because you saved my life, he said finally, and because I don't like watching the weak get bullied by men who think they're strong. He stood and pulled her up with him. Now wipe your tears. We've got work to do. Luca left the estate right after the conversation in his office, saying only, I'll be back, before the black SUV swallowed him into the gray noon. Grace stood at the window and watched until the vehicle disappeared beyond the electronic gate, then turned back to Mia and Mrs. Park and tried to pretend everything was normal. But how could anything be normal when she didn't know where Luca was going, what he was doing, or whether he was killing someone for her? 6 hours passed like 6 years. Grace played with Mia in the new toy room, read to her, fed her lunch and a snack, but her mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Park sat in the corner, knitting with trembling hands, occasionally glancing at Grace with guilty eyes. Grace knew she was thinking about the letters she'd written to Kevin, the secret she'd betrayed, but Grace didn't have the strength to be angry. Not now. Not when she was going mad with worry over what Luca might be doing to Tyler. She thought about Tyler, about the early days when he'd been gentle, bringing her flowers every week, cooking dinner every night. Then he started drinking, started getting jealous for no reason, started controlling everything she did, everyone she met, everywhere she went. And then he started hitting her. At first it was just a slap, then a fist. Then that night, the night he kicked her down in the kitchen and kept kicking until her ribs cracked. She remembered the taste of blood in her mouth. She remembered him growling, "You're mine. Nobody gets to look at you." She remembered lying on the cold floor thinking she was going to die there. But she didn't die. She survived. She escaped. And now, after 2 years, Tyler was still trying to drag her back into that hell. The sun had set when the sound of a vehicle came outside. Grace ran into the hallway, heart hammering, and breathed out in relief when she saw Luca step through the front door. He still wore the same black suit he'd left in, but something was different. The smell of smoke clung to him, sharp and thick, and on his face was a weariness she'd never seen before. "It's handled," he said, pulling off his jacket and tossing it onto a chair. Grace froze. Handled how? Luca looked at her, his black eyes unreadable. Tyler Reed withdrew his custody petition. He also signed papers relinquishing all rights to Mia, permanently. Grace's legs threatened to give way. He agreed. He didn't have a choice, Luca said, calm in a way that was terrifying. He's on a plane to Seattle right now. There's a new job waiting for him there, and a very clear reminder of what will happen if he comes near you or Mia again. Grace stared at him, at the smoke in his clothes, at the exhaustion on his face, and the question escaped before she could stop it. "Did you kill him?" Silence stretched. Luca studied her for a moment, then one corner of his mouth lifted. "I prefer clean solutions when children are involved," he said. "Tyler Reed is alive. Terrified, but alive. He'll never come back. I guarantee it." And then Grace cried. She hadn't meant to, didn't want to, but the tears came like a broken dam. 2 years. 2 years living in fear, looking over her shoulder every time she went outside, flinching at every knock, waking from nightmares of Tyler finding her. And now, in one afternoon, Luca Romano had done what she couldn't do for 2 years. He made Tyler disappear. A warm hand touched her shoulder, and Grace looked up at Luca through tears. "Don't cry," he said, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle. "Tyler was only the first threat. We still have to deal with Kevin Park." Grace nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She knew the war wasn't over, but for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. 3 months passed like a dream Grace didn't dare believe was real. They moved from the lakefront estate to a luxurious brownstone in the Gold Coast, where Chicago's richest lived. The home had 3 floors, classic red brick, tall windows, and a small garden out back. From the outside, it looked like any other house in that elite neighborhood, but inside it was fitted with the most advanced security money could buy, cameras at every corner, bullet-resistant doors, a team of guards patrolling 24 hours a day. Luca Romano never gambled with the safety of the people he protected. Mia began attending the best preschool in the city, where 1 year of tuition probably equaled what Grace used to earn in 3 years at Giovanni's. Mia adjusted with shocking ease, making friends, coming home each day chattering about her teacher, her classmates, and the pictures she drew. Grace listened, heart filling with a feeling she'd forgotten the name of. Happiness. This was happiness. Mrs. Park had her own room on the 2nd floor, larger and brighter than her old apartment in Chicago. She still made kimchi every week, still knitted every evening, but the worried crease on her forehead had softened. She never mentioned the letters to Kevin, and Grace never asked. Some wounds needed time. But the biggest change was Mia and Luca. Grace didn't know exactly when it began. Maybe when Luca sat on the floor and played dolls with Mia for the first time, or when he lifted Mia onto his shoulders and ran around the garden while she shrieked with laughter. But one day Mia ran to Luca when he walked in the door and shouted, "Lulu," and Grace saw something she couldn't believe. The most feared Mafia boss in Chicago melted completely. His black eyes brightened, his mouth curved into a real smile, and he lifted Mia as if she were the most precious treasure on earth. "Lulu is home," Mia squealed, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck, and Luca, a man who killed without hesitation, just held her and murmured, "Yes, Lulu is home," in the gentlest voice Grace had ever heard. As for Grace and Luca, They ate dinner together every night, unless he had business he wouldn't describe. They talked about everything and nothing, about Mia, about his work that she never pressed for details on, about the past that scarred them both. Then dinners turned into nights. And in those nights, Grace discovered Luca Romano could be both fierce and tender, both demanding and generous, both possessive and reverent. For the first time in her life, she learned what it felt like to be loved instead of owned. One night, in the dark, bodies still slick with sweat, Luca pulled her against him and whispered into her hair. "I existed before I met you, Grace. Building an empire, destroying enemies, gathering power. But I wasn't living. I was just existing." He paused, warm breath against her skin. "You brought me back. You and Mia." Grace didn't speak. She only rested her head on his chest, listened to the steady beat of the man who'd pulled her from the dark, and wondered if she was dreaming. But happiness, as she'd learned, never lasted forever. The bad news came on a Tuesday morning, when Grace was feeding Mia breakfast in the kitchen. Luca walked in with his phone in hand, and one look at his face told her something was wrong. He didn't speak until Sophia took Mia upstairs to get dressed for school. Then he sat across from Grace, black eyes carrying a seriousness she hadn't seen in 3 months. "Kevin Park will be released early," he said, bluntly. 2 weeks. The coffee in Grace's hand nearly slipped. She set it down, her fingers trembling so badly the liquid rippled. "Earlier than expected," she whispered. "Good behavior," Luca said, his voice flat. "And there's more. He hired a lawyer. A good one, not cheap. He filed for custody the moment he learned he was getting out." The kitchen seemed to spin. Grace gripped the table edge to steady herself. "He can't do that," she said, her voice rising. "He's a criminal. He committed armed robbery. He served 4 years. No court would hand my daughter to a man like that." Luca studied her for a long moment, then his mouth twisted into a joyless smile. "I'm a criminal too, Grace," he said slowly. "The only difference between me and Kevin Park is I've never been caught." The words hit like ice water. Grace opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came, because he was right. Luca Romano was a mafia boss, a killer, the man who ruled Chicago's largest criminal empire. And she was living in his home, sleeping in his bed, letting her daughter call him Lulu. What right did she have to judge Kevin Park? "But he left me," she said, weaker now. "He didn't know about Mia until Mrs. Park wrote to him. He didn't raise her a single day." "Legally, that doesn't matter," Luca said. "Kevin Park is Mia's biological father. He served his sentence, paid for his crimes, and now he wants to be a father." He paused, staring into her eyes. "In the eyes of the court, that's his legal right." Grace stood and paced the kitchen like an animal trapped in a cage. She thought about Kevin, the man she'd loved for 3 short months, the man she ran from when she discovered who he really was. He wasn't violent like Tyler. He didn't control her or beat her, but he was a criminal. He chose that life instead of choosing her, choosing a family, choosing an ordinary future. And now, after 8 years in prison, he believed he could return and claim the daughter Grace had raised alone. "I won't let him take Mia," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'll do anything." Luca stood, came to her, and placed his hand on her shoulder, turning her to face him. "I know," he said softly, "and I've got a solution, but you need to hear me out before you decide." Grace looked up at the man who saved her from Tyler, the man who gave her and Mia a new life, the man who taught her how to trust again after everything she'd endured. "I'm listening," she said. Luca led her into his office, closed the door, and locked it. Morning sunlight poured through the window, laying golden stripes on the oak floor, but Grace felt no warmth, only cold, cold to the bone, at the thought of Kevin Park and the possibility of losing Mia. "Marry me," Luca said. No preamble, no softening. Grace was sure she misheard. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, black eyes steady on hers. "Become my wife. Let me adopt Mia. Let her take the Romano name. As my wife and daughter, you'll be protected by every resource I have, and no court will dare hand her to an ex-con when her stepfather is." He paused, one corner of his mouth lifting, a successful businessman. Grace shook her head, stepping back. "You don't want to marry me? This is just a solution to a problem, like how you handled Tyler. Like how you handle everything, Grace." "No," she cut him off, her voice trembling but resolute. "I married for the wrong reasons once already. With Tyler, I thought he loved me, but he only wanted to own me. I won't make that mistake again. I'm not Tyler." Luca's voice dropped, carrying something Grace had never heard from him before, something like pain, "I know you're not Tyler," she said, eyes falling to the floor. "But you don't love me either. You protect me because I saved your life. You sleep with me because—" She couldn't finish. Because it was easy. Because she was there. Because he was lonely. Silence stretched. Grace didn't dare look up. Didn't dare see his face when he confirmed what she'd said. But he didn't confirm it. Instead, Luca stepped closer. Closer. So close, she felt his warmth. Breathed in the familiar cologne she'd somehow come to crave. "Look at me," he said, his voice like an order. Grace lifted her gaze, and what she saw in his black eyes stole her breath. Not the cold calculation she'd grown used to, not the flawless control he always wore, but something deeper, fiercer, and far more frightening. "I've loved you since the moment you threw pasta in an assassin's face to save a stranger," Luca said, every word slow and clear, as if he needed her to hear every syllable. "I just didn't know how to say it. I've never loved anyone. Never let anyone close enough to love, and then you showed up, with your delivery bag and your fearless eyes, and you shattered everything I built around myself." Grace opened her mouth to speak, but Luca pressed a finger to her lips, stopping her. "What I feel for you," he continued, his voice roughening, "scares me more than any enemy I've ever faced. Viktor Petrov could send an army, and I wouldn't be afraid. But the thought of losing you, losing Mia, losing this small family—" He stopped, jaw tight. "It keeps me awake at night." Tears filled Grace's eyes. She thought she understood Luca Romano, thought he was cold and calculating, heartless. But the man standing before her now, eyes full of emotion he didn't bother to hide, wasn't heartless. He was a man who'd hidden his heart for so long he nearly forgot it existed. "I'm not asking you to marry me because it's a solution," Luca said, his hand lifting her face, his thumb wiping away a tear sliding down her cheek. "I'm asking you to marry me because I want you to be my wife. I want Mia to be my daughter. I want to wake up every morning and see you beside me." He lowered his forehead to hers. "I'm asking you because I love you, Grace Mitchell. And I'll burn this whole world down before I let anyone take you from me." Grace closed her eyes, letting his words sink into her bones. She thought of the last 3 months, of the way he protected her and Mia, of the dinners and long nights, of the way he looked at her daughter as if Mia were the most precious thing in his life. And she realized, maybe she'd known for a long time, known she loved him too. She'd only been too afraid to admit it. "Yes," she whispered, opening her eyes and meeting his gaze, watching him wait. "I'll marry you." And when Luca bent and kissed her, Grace knew this wasn't a solution. It was a beginning. Luca refused to wait. He said each day that passed was one more day Kevin Park drew closer, and he had no intention of letting anything threaten his family. So, in just 3 days, the Gold Coast brownstone became the site of the most elegant wedding Grace had ever seen. White roses and pale pink peonies covered the back garden. White ribbons curled through the branches. A floral arch rose at the end of the aisle. Grace didn't ask what it cost. She knew the answer would make her dizzy. A wedding dress arrived from a famous designer in New York, tailored perfectly to her measurements, even though she couldn't remember giving them to anyone. Pure white silk hugged her body. A long train flowed behind her. Tiny crystals glittered like stars across the fabric. When Grace looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. The exhausted delivery girl in frayed clothes with the stink of burnt tomato sauce was gone. In her place stood a bride so beautiful it made her breath catch, gray-blue eyes shining with happiness. Mrs. Park cried the moment she saw Grace in the dress and didn't stop until the ceremony ended. She gripped Grace's hands before Grace stepped into the garden, apologizing through sobs, for the letters, for Kevin, for everything. Grace held her and whispered that it was over, that Mrs. Park had cared for Mia when Grace had no one, and that mattered more than any mistake. Mia was the flower girl, wearing a pale pink dress puffed like a princess, clutching a small basket. She walked ahead of Grace, scattering petals, occasionally turning back to flash her mother a wide, delighted grin. Grace's heart felt like it might burst with love just looking at her. There weren't many guests, only about 20 people, most of them Luca's men. They stood on either side of the aisle in expensive black suits, faces stern, and Grace knew each jacket hid a gun. This was a Mafia boss's wedding, and even on the happiest day, they never let their guard down. Sophia stood in the front row with a warm smile, and Marco, Luca's chief bodyguard, gave Grace a subtle nod as she passed. But all of that blurred when Grace saw Luca beneath the floral arch. He wore a black suit and a white shirt, looking like he'd stepped from a magazine cover. Yet it wasn't the clothes that stole Grace's breath. It was the way he looked at her. His black eyes shone with something she'd only recently learned to recognize. Love, pure and fierce. The ceremony moved quickly. Traditional vows spoken. Rings slid into place. Grace's ring held a glittering diamond that likely cost more than the house she used to live in. But she didn't care about the price. She cared about the meaning, the promise it represented. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Luca pulled her into his arms, leaned down, and whispered into her ear before he kissed her. "You're mine. Finally. Completely mine." And Grace, the woman who once swore she would never belong to anyone again, realized belonging to Luca Romano didn't feel like being owned. It felt like being sheltered, loved, like coming home. On their wedding night, after the guests had gone and Mia was asleep in her room, Luca carried Grace upstairs as if she weighed nothing. He laid her gently on the bed, then lay beside her, fingers smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "I don't deserve you," he said softly, his black eyes on her in the dark. "I've done terrible things. I'll do terrible things again, but I'll spend my life giving you everything you deserve. Safety, happiness, love." He lowered his head and kissed her forehead. "I promise." Grace pulled him down, her lips finding his in the dark. "I don't need you perfect," she whispered. "I just need you to be mine." And that night, they belonged to each other completely. 2 weeks after the wedding, Grace sat in a sleek law office in downtown Chicago, gripping Luca's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. The room was dressed in oak and leather, framed diplomas on the walls, a long polished conference table in the center. Luca's attorney, a silver-haired man with an expressionless face, sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents before him. And across from Grace, only a few feet away, sat Kevin Park. She barely recognized him. The man she'd loved almost 4 years ago was gone, replaced by a stranger with prison tattoos climbing up his neck, thick muscles under a cheap white t-shirt, and brown eyes hard as stone. 8 years in prison had changed Kevin Park completely. He was no longer the gentle young man whose smile once melted her heart. He was something else, something dangerous. Kevin's eyes found Grace the moment she walked in, and she saw something flash in his gaze. Regret. Ennui. She wasn't sure, and she didn't want to know. She only wanted it to be over. "Grace," Kevin said, his voice rough from years. "You look different." She didn't answer. Luca tightened his grip on her hand and guided her into the chair beside him, his gaze fixed on Kevin with the cold focus of a predator. "We're not here to make small talk," Luca said, his tone as calm as if discussing the weather. "We're here to settle a problem." Kevin looked at Luca, then at Marco, standing in the corner with arms folded, stone-faced and ice-eyed. Kevin wasn't stupid. He knew who Luca Romano was. He knew the empire that man commanded. He knew what happened to people who challenged Chicago's Mafia boss. "I just want to meet my daughter," Kevin said, but the confidence in his voice had thinned. "That's my right." "Mia isn't your daughter," Luca replied, his voice sharp as a blade. "You only contributed half the ADN, feeding her, teaching her to speak, staying up when she was sick. That was Grace. And now, that's me." Kevin's jaw clenched, muscle twitching. "I've got legal rights." "Legal rights," Luca echoed, one corner of his mouth lifting into a humorless smile. "Yes, you do. You can go to court, fight for custody, drag this out for years." He leaned forward, black eyes cutting into Kevin. "Or you can accept my offer and walk away with a new life." The lawyer slid a folder toward Kevin. Kevin opened it, skimmed, and Grace saw his eyes widen. $100,000, Luca said, as if talking about pocket change. "Deposited into your account the moment you sign, plus a job in Portland, Oregon. Legal, good pay, enough to start over. And your record gets wiped. No criminal history. A fresh start. A complete fresh start." Kevin looked up from the papers, his gaze shifting between Luca and Grace. "And in return, you sign away your rights as a father," Luca said. "Permanently. No contact with Mia. No searching for her. No speaking her name. As far as you're concerned, she doesn't exist." Silence stretched. Grace's heart hammered, her hand crushing Luca's. She watched Kevin, the man who had once been her child's father, and waited. Kevin looked at the folder again. Then he looked at Marco, still a statue in the corner, eyes promising violence. Then he looked at Luca, who had offered something they both knew wasn't truly an offer. It was an ultimatum. Accept it, or face consequences no one wanted to speak aloud. "Is she happy?" Kevin asked suddenly, eyes on Grace. "Mia, is she happy?" Grace swallowed, then nodded. "She's very happy." Kevin held her gaze for a long moment. Then he exhaled, reached for the pen the attorney offered, and spoke quietly. "I hope you give her a good life. Then he signed. When the pen lifted from the final page, Grace felt as if a massive weight had been pulled off her chest. Mia was safe. Mia was legally Luca Romano's daughter, and no one could take her from Grace again. 6 months passed after the day Kevin Park signed away his rights, and Grace realized she'd changed in ways she never expected. She no longer looked over her shoulder on the street, no longer calculated escape routes every time she walked into a new room, no longer jolted at every knock on the door. 2 years of running from Tyler, then the fear of Kevin. All of it dissolved like fog under sunlight. For the first time in her life, Grace Mitchell, now Grace Romano, felt truly safe. The Gold Coast brownstone became a real home. Every morning she woke to the smell of fresh coffee drifting up from downstairs, to Mia's giggles echoing from the kitchen, and to Luca speaking to the little girl in a gentle voice. Grace still couldn't believe belonged to the most feared man in Chicago. Mrs. Park still lived with them, fully folded into the new family, making kimchi each week and teaching Mia a few simple Korean phrases. Sophia ran the household with remarkable efficiency, and there was always a team of guards outside, but their presence became so familiar Grace nearly forgot they were there. The biggest change came from Mia. She stopped calling Luca Lulu. Now, with the clear, bright voice of a 3-year-old, she called him Daddy. The first time Luca heard it, Grace saw him freeze as if turned to stone, his black eyes shining with something she recognized as tears. He knelt, pulled Mia into his arms, and couldn't speak for a long time. After that, every time Mia ran to him and squealed, "Daddy's home," the ruthless Mafia boss melted into a loving father, and Grace knew she'd made the right choice when she said yes. One night, after Mia had fallen asleep and the house sank into quiet, Grace and Luca lay together in the dark. She curled into his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, and the question she'd held back for so long finally slipped free. "Can you leave that world?" she whispered. "The Mafia, the violence, all of it. Can you stop?" Luca was silent for a long moment. His hand stroked her hair, a familiar gesture she'd come to love. "No," he said finally, his voice low and honest. "I am who I am, Grace. I built this empire when I was still a kid. It's part of me, like blood in my veins. I can't change that, and I won't lie to you and say I can." Grace closed her eyes, disappointment flickering, but no surprise. She'd known the answer before she asked. "But," Luca continued, lifting her chin so she could look into his eyes in the dark, "I can make sure that world never touches you and Mia. I can build walls around this family, walls no enemy can break through. I can give you and her a normal life, safe and happy, even if my life is never normal." He kissed her forehead. "I've killed people. I'll kill again. I don't apologize for it." His voice dropped. "But I'll burn this whole world down before I let anyone touch my family. That's not a threat, that's the truth." Grace looked up at the man she loved, dangerous and tender, ruthless and devoted, and she understood she didn't need him perfect. She only needed him to be hers. "I know," she whispered, then rested her head on his chest and closed her eyes. "I know." Morning sunlight slipped through the curtains, laying warm golden streaks across the king-size bed as Grace slowly opened her eyes. The other side of the bed was empty, but she didn't worry. Instead, she lay still and listened to the sounds rising from downstairs, pots and pans clinking, water running, and Mia's bright giggles, the most beautiful sound Grace had ever heard. She pulled on the silk robe Luca had bought her and walked barefoot down the stairs. The scent of pancakes and fresh coffee filled the air, and when she stepped into the kitchen, the sight before her made her throat tighten. Luca Romano, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, stood at the stove wearing a blue apron tied around his waist, flipping pancakes in a pan. Mia sat on the counter beside him, legs swinging, grinning wide, and on Luca's nose was a streak of white flour that made him look like a clown instead of a kingpin. "Daddy's making smiley-face pancakes for me," Mia shouted, pointing at the plate in front of her, where 2 pancakes had been decorated with chocolate eyes and a strawberry jam smile. Then she spotted Grace and squealed with joy. "Daddy, Mommy's awake." Luca turned, and the smile he gave Grace made her forget how to breathe. This was the man who killed without hesitation, who built an empire out of blood and tears, who made an entire city tremble. But right now, with flour on his nose and an apron around his waist, he was just a husband making breakfast for his family. "Morning," he said, lifting the pan. "Pancakes." Grace walked up, wiped the flour from his nose, and kissed him, quick and soft. "Morning," she whispered. Mia demanded to be held, and Grace lifted her, hugging the small, warm body close. 3 years old, brown curls, bright brown eyes, smelling of baby soap and happiness. The child knew nothing about Mafia wars, about Daddy's enemies, about the dangerous world beyond these walls. She only knew she was loved, and that was all that mattered. Grace sat at the table with Mia in her lap, watching Luca set out breakfast. Mrs. Park came down a few minutes later, still sleepy but smiling at the sight of them together. Sophia brought fresh orange juice and fruit, and in that moment, seated among the people she loved most, Grace realized how far she had come. 9 months earlier, she was an exhausted delivery girl in a kitchen that smelled of burnt garlic, worried about rent and a prescription she couldn't afford. She walked into a luxury penthouse and faced 4 assassins. She threw a bag of pasta into an assassin's face to save a stranger. She fell into the arms of the most dangerous man she'd ever met. And somehow, in the chaos and danger, she found the one thing she never dared dream of. She found home. Not the elegant brownstone with modern security, not the expensive clothes or lavish meals, but belonging, safety, unconditional love. Mia's laughter, Luca's eyes when he looked at her, Mrs. Park knitting in the corner, Sophia bringing warm food, all the small things that made a family. Grace Mitchell once believed she would run forever. From Tyler. From the past. From the fear embedded in her bones. But sometimes life takes you to the most unexpected places. Sometimes the one who saves you is the man the world calls a monster. Sometimes home isn't a place at all, but the people who make you feel welcomed. And Grace, the delivery girl who saved a mafia boss with a bag of pasta, finally came home. Grace and Luca's story shows that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that the past doesn't define the future, and that everyone deserves to be loved and protected. Wherever you are in life, whatever you've been through, keep believing that happiness is waiting ahead. Sometimes all it takes is one brave moment, one impulsive decision, to change everything. Thank you for listening to this story. If you were moved, if Grace's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so more people can hear it. Every day, we bring you meaningful, emotional stories, and your support is the greatest motivation for us to keep going. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had a moment when life suddenly changed completely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what's in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Treasure the people you love, because they are your home. Goodbye, and see you in the next video. S.